My guest this week is Mollie Hemingway. She is a Fox News contributor, senior editor of the online magazine The Federalist, and co-author of the national bestseller Justice on Trial, The Kavanaugh Confirmation and the Future of the Supreme Court. I invited her on to discuss her most recent book, Rigged: How the Media, Big Tech, and the Democrats Seized Our Elections. Here's the first segment of our interview. Mollie, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here with you.
So what made you decide to write a book about the 2020 election?
Mostly, I just thought it was weird that you weren't allowed to talk about it after the election. It was an election unlike any one that we'd ever experienced. And we all know that because we all lived through it. But you weren't allowed to have any questions about it, even though, it was very different from any election we'd ever gone through. So I knew I wanted to research myself and report myself to find out what happened. And I'm really glad I did, because I thought what I found out was very interesting.
So the book is rigged, and you mentioned three players that were important to what happened in the 2020 election: the media, big tech, and the Democrats. I want to start with the third piece. A lot of people don't realize that this isn't new. So Republicans are constantly attacked for voter suppression and gerrymandering, which of course is not solely Republicans, it's whoever's in power in that particular state. But we hear that a lot. So everybody knows that. But, there were a lot of things that have been happening over the years. Can you talk about some of the procedural changes that Democrats have been implementing over the years, from ballot harvesting to how we got to mail-in? I mean, obviously, COVID supersized the mail-in ballots, but we were doing it before, and all those little things that they were doing to tip the scales in their favor.
Yeah, COVID, people thought that the reason why the 2020 election was administered so differently was because of COVID. And that's kind of true. But the reality is that all of the changes that were implemented were things that the Democratic Party had actually sought for a very long time that had nothing to do with COVID. And in general, their approach is to greatly expand the sphere of litigation for voting. And that can mean expanding election day from 1 day to literally 2 months, or having ballots come in weeks after the deadline, or removing or downplaying any kind of scrutiny of mail-in ballots, whether that's a signature check or voter ID or whatever the thing is where you're trying to make sure the ballot is actually associated with a human. They're kind of getting rid of some of those things. It's about all sorts of things that the result has been to create chaos and confusion around Election Day, to make it more difficult for neighbors and citizens to have oversight of the vote counting process. And COVID was how all of this happened nationwide. But these things had actually been in writing sought by Democrats for years, if not decades prior. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting about the Democratic strategy there is a highly funded, very well orchestrated, highly staffed operation. And it's led by a guy named Mark Elias. And when I came across his name, I just was stunned, because he's also the guy who ran the 2016 Russia collusion hoax. He's literally the guy who wrote the check to hire the people who made up that lie that caused so much damage to the country in 2016 through now. And then he also was the guy who ran the operation to create chaos and confusion out of the 2020 campaign. It's just fascinating to me that it's one guy who's caused that much harm to the Republic.
Why don't people know this was happening? So we know about the media disinformation and the media controlling things, but most of that stuff was during the election and after the election. But these things, as you mentioned, have been going on for years, some decades, some 3 or 4 years, some started in 2016. And a lot of these things are done on a local and state level. So how are they able to do this without anyone seeing it or hearing about it?
So partly it's just that Democrats have cared much more about this topic than Republicans have, and they have the finances and the army ready to do battle. But one of the stories I tell in the book, which also blew me away, was that for 38 years, the Republican National Committee was barred from having anything to do with Election Day oversight or litigation. They had gotten involved in it, like back in the early 80s, they'd done something where the court slapped them into a consent decree where they agreed that they wouldn't do anything with Election Day oversight for a few years. And then the judge who put them into that was this like crazy lefty judge, and he just kept them in for so long. He retired, but he took senior status so he could keep on doing this. It took him dying and being replaced by a different liberal judge, but like a sane Obama appointee, who said, this is crazy. We've got to let the Republicans out of this consent decree. It was so sensitive that they almost extended it because Sean Spicer, who worked on the 2016 campaign, was reportedly on the wrong floor of Trump Tower on election night. And so they almost kept them in for another few years. And it just is, when you learn stuff like this, it's kind of amazing that Republicans have ever won any elections, given that like the Democrats had this high powered operation, coordinated at the highest levels, and and Republicans literally couldn't do a thing until 2018. And then once they did it, once they were allowed in, they didn't really have that muscle memory of knowing how to do election day litigation or oversight. But it was just a fascinating story that I couldn't believe had actually happened.
Oh, wow. So there's so many things that happen because, we're going to get to the point where you talk about the things that they did that literally were set up to help Trump lose. But I want people to understand that it's not just a Trump thing, because when you look at it as a Trump thing, he's so divisive, then people just throw their hands up and say they don't care. A lot of this is systems, right? The systems only work when you follow the process that's put into place, and no one's forcing them to follow the processes. So I want to move to that a bit. In the book, you write a chapter, for instance. It's Chapter 9, 14 Seconds Too Late. And if they don't read the whole book, which I suggest they do, they have to read this chapter because it talks about some of these things. And part of it is I don't think people understand what voter fraud or election tampering or these types of terms mean, right? They think it means stuff in the ballot. But in my book, it's anytime you're doing anything that would circumvent the legal process. And a lot of that happened regardless of what you think is Trump. So you talk about the people who were trying to, the Republican attorneys who were there to view what was happening, and they kept them back. And everybody saw the guy on the news with the binoculars and like, that's crazy. But the mail-in ballots are important. So talk about that process. I don't think people understand it. You got these mail-in ballots that aren't supposed to be counted until a certain time. And my friend is an example. He showed up to check those mail-in ballots as they're open. And when he got there, they were already open. So what people need to understand is if every one of those, let's say there were 100,000 ballots, if every one of them were Joe Biden ballots, it still doesn't matter because they should not have been open. So explain some of that stuff.
Thank you so much for highlighting this, because I think that sometimes when people talk about election irregularities, they're only talking about fraud. And fraud does happen. It's a real thing. It's bad and it's very difficult to catch. So I don't want to, diminish that. But so much more of what we're talking about are these other things. For instance, like you bring up, in Pennsylvania, they made the move in 2019 to have mail-in balloting. And they had millions of mail-in ballots flooding the system. The legislature there had made a rule that you weren't allowed to open up the ballots until Election Day. Most people interpreted that to mean you weren't allowed to open up the ballots until Election Day. But certain counties said, well, they didn't say anything about inspecting the outside of the inner, they're like two envelopes or something like that, right, in Pennsylvania. So they, in certain counties, hired people, and they hired people, by the way, with Zuckerberg funding, which I hope we can talk about here in a second. But they hired them to do what's called like curing the ballot. So if you get a ballot and someone didn't sign it or didn't put their address or didn't date it, that should be not accepted according to the law. But you can go back to the voter and say, would you like to fix this? Or you could, in certain places, certain states, they allow you to fix it yourself as an election worker. But if you're only doing that in certain counties and not the other counties, and if you're doing it contrary to the law, you're disenfranchising all the law-abiding voters and all the law-abiding counties. And there are other issues, like in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, a major effort of Mark Elias was to keep all third parties off the ballot. Well, in some states, that doesn't matter much. In Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, those are two states that have a long history of voting Green Party. And they did it with all third parties. The chapter is called 14 Seconds Too Late because that's how they kept Kanye West off the ballot in Wisconsin. he got his paperwork in on time, but then later they said, actually, it was 14 seconds too late, which is just absurd. And that shows you why it's so important that people fight over the way these rules are engaged and like how to follow them, because it really does affect electoral outcomes.
Coming up, more with Mollie Hemingway, author of Rigged. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
We return to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer. Once again, here's Charles Love.
Are you tired of summer nights in Maine?
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Mollie Hemingway, author of Rigged. And in the last segment, we were talking about one of the three main focuses of the book, talking about the Democrats and talking about procedural issues. Here we finish with that and move into the second phase, big tech, and what effect they had on the election.
And Charles, sorry, you pointed out the binoculars, and I just wanted to add to that. If on election day or whenever the ballots are separated from their envelopes, you don't have independent oversight, it makes people lose trust in the process. And in Philadelphia, they had to go to court to be able to be within 100 yards of the separation process, because that's where you need to be. Because if they say, we're going to count this ballot, even though it doesn't have a signature, you need to be there right then to challenge it, because once it's separated, there's nothing you can do. And it doesn't matter how many audits or whatever you have. It doesn't matter, because the ballot has already been removed from the envelopes. You wouldn't know which ballot to go get, that's in question.
Right. So for those who don't get it, 2 envelopes written on the outside, they separate them. Once, if the first envelope was flawed and should not have been counted, it's in the garbage now. So now it's just a room full of second envelopes. So it doesn't matter. That's what she means. It doesn't matter what you audit. It doesn't matter. You're going to keep coming up with the same number. Yeah, it's 1 million. Yes, because 100,000 of them should have been thrown out, but I can't prove it because the original envelope is gone, and that's what's important. And obviously that's not going to get reported. I don't want to go to the media yet. You mentioned Zuckerberg, and he should be in jail as a chapter. So let's talk. Yeah, you're going to have time to talk about that. Let's talk about big tech. So what is the big tech role in the problems of the election of 2020?
Yeah, I think we talk all about election laws, but probably big tech has had more of an influence in the outcome of elections than anybody else. And partly that's related to their censorship regime and how they deplatform voices they don't like, or how they elevate voices they do like. But what was really amazing about the 2020 election was that Mark Zuckerberg spent $419 million to engage in the private takeover of government election offices. So he gave money to these 2 left-wing groups, and those groups gave grants to different cities and counties. They focused their grant giving on blue counties in swing states. So they didn't really worry about super red or super blue states. They just focused on swing states, and then they funded the blue counties in the swing states in order to run the Democratic Party's get out the vote operation through the government offices. So that means everything from voter registration to voter messages like marketing to go vote, ballot design, ballot translation, ballot curing, ballot harvesting, ballot counting. They actually ran that operation in the government offices with this Zuckerberg money and with left-wing activists. And it would be like, if the Green Bay Packers hired and staffed all the referees for a game with the Bears, and then you're supposed to trust the results, even though the other team ran the whole officiating and paid the people who did it. You're not going to trust the results because they're compromised.
Huh. That takes a lot to soak in. I wasn't following this as closely as you, but I recall Democrats raising bloody hell because Republicans were suppressing the vote. And one example was you couldn't get a sandwich when you were in line or something crazy like that. What do you mean you can't give the guy water? That's racist. But Zuckerberg can hire people to promote the Democrats, politicians out of the offices. That's fascinating.
But even that, people don't understand. There are the history of voting in America has a lot of chapters, including that, it used to be that you voted publicly. And then and then they got rid of that because they knew that if you owed someone money, they could say, well, if you vote for me, I'll knock off $5 from what you owe me. And then it was that parties printed up their own ballots, and then they would watch people go into the voting booths and, put the ballot for the particular party into the slot. And so again, people were being coerced. And so they moved to private ballot so that there wouldn't be coercion. And one of the reasons why you're not allowed to give gifts of substantial quality, and you are allowed to, supply water or whatnot through the government, is because they don't want people being coerced to vote one way or the other, or feel indebted to one group or another. And these things really do matter. It wasn't that long ago that the Democratic Party had completely disenfranchised like all blacks in the South through arbitrary Jim Crow voting restrictions and laws. Like, that's a real thing that happened and that we had to fight hard to get rid of. So it's one of the reasons why it's so offensive when people say that asking for voter ID, which is something that basically everybody in the country supports, like it's an 80% issue, saying that that is racist is itself racist. To say that that's Jim Crow is ridiculous and offensive. But the idea that like you can't get an ID if you're a different race than white is just like one of the more racist things I can think of to have out there.
But don't we actually have evidence of some of these things happening? I mean, not as large scale as Zuckerberg, but people paying in some ways. I remember one, I think it was the 2012 election, openly offering voters like lottery tickets if they voted.
That actually has been one of the issues. I mean, I think it was the Gore election, so that would be 2000. There was this super wealthy Democratic woman, I forget her name, but she came out of New York City, but she was working in Detroit, and they were giving people on the street cigarettes in exchange for votes, and like packs of cigarettes, which broke the voting rules because you're not allowed to give anything worth more than $1. And so like that happened, and she got away with it, but she was under investigation for some time. And then also in 2020, there were violations, which were that the Biden campaign, or maybe it was the Democratic Party, ran these raffles on Native American reservations in Nevada. Again, that violates the federal election code. You're not supposed to give things of value in exchange for votes. And yet they ran these like in multiple ways, and they kind of got away with it again. So it does happen. You have to be on top of it. And it's not nothing. That's a pretty sizable population in Nevada.
Right. So Zuckerberg did his personal fortune to push the vote and put his thumb on the scale. But then there is big tech, as in social media, Google searches, and those kind of things. What did big tech do to affect the election that way?
So in 2016, the media did their thing where they decided that they had to be more hostile, like cartoonishly hostile to the Republican nominee, as opposed to merely biased as they had been in previous elections. And to get around it, Donald Trump starts speaking directly to people through social media. So when he wins, these social media oligarchs and CEOs they feel kind of guilty. They think that maybe they were responsible for his victory, and that if they had behaved inappropriately, that maybe he wouldn't have won. So they kind of are open about it, and they say, we're never going to let this happen again. And they start doing much more of censorship, suppression of information, manipulation of information. And this can look so many different ways. It could be that, when you type in something into a search engine, you only get responses, or you predominantly get responses from left-wing outlets as opposed to right-wing outlets, that they push voting messages to people that they have decided are more likely to vote Democrat. There have been studies showing that messages went to left-leaning voters that did not go to right-leaning voters about the need to register to vote or to get out and vote. Just all sorts of things, like deplatforming every effective conservative voice that they could find, elevating left-wing voices, constraining the reach of non-leftist media outlets. I mean, they are so powerful. It is so much more important than all of the voting shenanigans combined, what they're able to do in terms of psychological manipulation through search algorithms and messing with those.
I got a story I like to tell because it's so important, and I think it paints a great picture, even though it doesn't really have anything to do with election. So my show was airing on the 4th of July, and I wanted to take that day off. So I think I was playing an old interview or something. So on the website, I said, what should I do? You know what would be cool? I'm going to say I'm off for the 4th of July, and I'm going to find a picture of a black man holding a flag. So I Google black man holding an American flag. It's so awesome. You should try it today. I don't know if it still works. Obviously, it was back in July. But I typed that and I got all these searches. And all of them were either pictures of white nationalists, right, with the fist up, or Nazi sign, or Klan stuff, or swastikas, a bunch of that weird. Black people yelling at like BLM kind of marches and things of that nature, and patriotic white guys with flags, like military guys. What I did not get was what I asked for. And it's fascinating with the reach that Google has and the number of people in the country that they could not produce one picture of a happy black man with a flag.
Well,
there was even a black man with a Confederate flag that came up.
Oh my gosh.
Coming up, more with Mollie Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist and author of Rigged. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Mollie Hemingway, author of Rigged, How the Media, Big Tech, and the Democrats Seized Our Elections. And in the last segment, I told a story. We had gotten onto big tech about how I just simply tried to find a black man with the flag, and Google would not allow that to happen. And so here we continue to talk about big tech and how they suppress information and dictate what you can and cannot see, and why it's harmful to the country.
They are constantly gaming around with these images or with other results. And it does have a profound effect on the way people understand the world and those around them. And it's terrifying. It's also just a war on information. And I think so much of our country is about the freedom to search for truth. And when you look at the First Amendment, freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, these are all fundamentally about our right to pursue the truth and not have that infringed upon by government. And so now you have these social media companies that are far more powerful than the government, sadly, and they are restricting our ability to find out basic information about all sorts of things, whether it's things that are important for the election. I mean, one of the stories that combines both what the media and big tech did in the 2020 election was how they went out of their way to violently suppress information about the Biden family business in the form of the Hunter Biden laptop story, which without investigation, they asserted was Russian misinformation, which was a lie, was itself misinformation. And they just refused to cover it. And they banned people from sharing it. They banned people who had reported it. I mean, it was the kind of thing you imagine happens in the Soviet Union, not happens in modern day United States. And it's just crazy that we got there so quickly.
Yeah. If you have anything else you want to add about big tech, feel free to think if it comes to mind. But one other thing I want to say, so we talked about Zuckerberg and his direct funding. We talked about social media and what they do, but it wasn't even limited to that when you talk about big tech, right? I remember getting emails from different, tech apps and other kind of companies, all these political messages, right, about racism, about this, about Trump, about how we, like Washington Post and the democracy dying in darkness crap. So you get that kind of stuff, but you're getting it from weird sources, right? Even normal people, I have friends and family who are apolitical. It's like, that's kind of odd. I just wanted to watch a nice little Netflix film. That's BLM in the corner. Or Grubhub is emailing me about voter rights and stuff. I'm like, what is this about, right? So that's another way where it just inundates you and it comes from everywhere. But lastly, the thing that got me was you talked about how important, one of the things that our republic being successful hangs on is free speech. And we don't want misinformation from government, right? You keep thinking about that. And like you say, you think the Soviet Union. But it's different when it's the public. I think I should have the right to say, I don't like certain things about people, and you can, come on that social platform and dispute what I say. But now they're talking, I know you see Jack Dorsey stepping down and people are digging up the new CEO's old tweets. But they say things like, well, it's our duty to stop disinformation. And I don't know if everybody agrees with me, but I'm like, why? If it's government disinformation, perhaps, but if Johnny in Alabama wants to say that he has proof that the election was stolen and you don't think it was, then disprove him. Why do we need to remove and ban people? Because we know what that will lead to. It only leads to one side being banned. And in the story you're talking about Hunter Biden's laptop, the most fascinating thing to me was that they banned, was it the Post? They banned everybody who listened to everything. They banned people from commenting on it. It was Russian disinformation. And then after the election was over, they just like normal, just like, you know what? That was actually true. We can prove that it was true. It was really his laptop. All that was fine. And you can go ahead and talk about it if you want to. And nobody, batted an eye of the fact that, but you're not saying anything about the fact that you remove people for doing it. There's no apology. It's just like, we figured out later that it was okay.
If we banned people for disinformation, the very first people who should be banned would be the New York Times and Washington Post and CNN and these media outlets that have not just they've willfully told lies about some of the most important stories of the last few years. Think about the Russia collusion hoax, where they asserted that Donald Trump was a traitor who had colluded with Russia to steal the 2016 election. That was an election conspiracy theory, which they now say you're not allowed to have any, which, fine. But they themselves were engaged and continue to be engaged in that election conspiracy theory, falsely claiming that he stole the election from its rightful victor, Hillary Clinton, by colluding with Russia. It was delusional. It was crazy. And they didn't just have a few stories about it. They had stories every few hours about it for years. It caused massive harm to the country. They awarded themselves Pulitzer Prizes for it. And now they're claiming that they are going to be the people to decide what is disinformation or what is misinformation. They are the safest bet is if they say something, it's almost like you can just take it to the bank that the opposite is the truth. And it's not just about Russia. It's about, again, like the elections, about the Kavanaugh confirmation, which is another story I focused on. They were just peddling wild, crazy stuff for years.
And now, as bad as things are, they may be getting worse. As Jack Dorsey steps down, there's concern over the new guy at the helm of Twitter and some of his beliefs on free speech. We will have to see. Coming up, more with Mollie Hemingway, author of Rigged. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Mollie Hemingway, Fox News contributor and author of Rigged. And so we've talked about big tech and we've talked about the Democrats and procedures and things they tried to change to affect the elections. And now we move on to the third and final piece, the media. And while the book is primarily about the media and the underhanded things that they did to affect the election of 2020, it's kind of hard to talk about them and not mention things on a larger scale. So here we talk about the deception in the media, what they include and what they don't include and how it affects things. And I start off by talking about the summer where the country was on fire. You talk about the media controlling the narrative. They led a nation to believe that cities weren't really burning. So January 6th was an insurrection without a weapon. Yet people burning down a police station where the police are running in retreat, running away from the people. That was just, exercising our First Amendment rights.
Yeah, I thought that was an important part of the 2020 story as well. I personally think that a lot of powerful people view it as an existential threat to their power, that what used to be like a stranglehold on the Black vote by the Democratic Party is weakening. Still, Black women tend to vote almost exclusively for the Democratic Party, but you're seeing huge breaks in this among Black males. And you're seeing it not just in terms of voting patterns, but in candidates that are running for office. You're just seeing this kind of all fall apart. And I think people view it as a huge problem. And I think that had something to do with why the 2020 riots happened. It was this desire, sort of frantic desire to tell everybody, we got to get back to our places. Everyone knows how they're supposed to vote. And it was accomplished through this like violence that happened across the country, which was deeply meaningful to people. And as you point out, yes, the rioters burned down a police station, many police stations, but like actually burned them down. They assaulted the White House and federal courthouses. And these are very bad acts of political violence. And most people recognize them as bad acts of political violence. And the media said it was mostly peaceful, no big deal. And then on January 6th, you had this riot at the Capitol, also a bad act of political violence. And people said that's an insurrection. It's like, well, wait, so you can go at the White House and federal courthouses, which are the other two branches of government, but you can't go after Congress? Like, really? I mean, I don't think you should go after any of them. But right. The point being, Americans saw what happened nationwide. And it was it was a really horrible thing that people were willing to like decrease race relations for the sake of a political victory. And yet, that's kind of been happening it's been happening for a long time, but it's still disheartening to see.
Right. And then, so we talk about the media and their role in this. So during the election, it was like I said, promoting BLM in 1619, promoting GOP as racist, suppressing things that Democrats do. You talk about the Hunter Biden story. There's plenty of stories. But then we get to the election and they win, hooray. And then afterwards, then they smeared people who ask questions, right? And they act like voter. Anybody who say that is just a right-wing, racist who would say anything about any voter improprieties. But it was unique. I mean, the way they speak is so you have to really pay attention to it because they parse their words. This is intentional, people. That they're not making mistakes. So they went from there's no fraud for like a week and a half. There was no fraud. There's no evidence of fraud. Then they went to this, no evidence of widespread fraud. I'm like, whoa. I focus on that stuff. I like a laser. I jump in. I'm like, why'd you add the word? If there was no fraud, that's perfect. Why do you need to now say widespread? Are you admitting that there was fraud? There's no widespread fraud. And nobody blinked an eye when they changed that word. So given the way that they report things, which we know is extremely not just biased, but antagonistic and in some ways aggressive toward people who don't think the way they do, how has your book been received?
So I was actually worried that, it's a well-reported book. I did a lot of research and reporting, and there's not a lick in there about any conspiracy theory or anything crazy. So I was worried that maybe people on both sides wouldn't like it, that, for the people on the left, they would just be upset that anybody was writing a book that talked about the problems with the 2020 election, but that people on the right would want more of that, Dominion voting systems or, that kind of thing that they talk about. And that's not the approach I took. I think the argument I make about Mark Zuckerberg's role in funding blue counties and swing states explains all of those numerical discrepancies that people had, seen right away. But it's gone great in terms of sales, in terms of interest. And I think people appreciate a sophisticated, nuanced argument. But on the left, people have mostly continued to ignore it. And that's what I wanted to say about the way they talk about it, that you're not allowed to talk about it. I think what they're trying to do is just run the same operation again. And so when they say, this is a big lie to have any questions about the election, what they're really saying is we would like to run this operation again. We'd like to do it next year and the year after that and the year after that. And so in order to do that, we need you to stop asking questions or have any thoughtful critique of the way we ran things so that we can continue to have corrupt media or corrupt tech companies or to continue to have the private takeover of government election offices or whatever the thing is. They just want to keep it going. And so I sort of don't even care when they say you're not allowed to talk about it because I've written a very, well-reported, well-researched book. So if they want to debate anything particular in that, that's fine. But I don't appreciate being told I can't talk about it. In fact, that's why I wrote it in the first place.
That is one of the most dangerous things we're facing, the fact that the media can deem what is violence and what is not violence, what is bad and what is good, and it has no bearing on reality. So we have to keep talking about that. Coming up, more with Mollie Hemingway, author of Rigged. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back. I've reached my final segment with Mollie Hemingway, Fox News contributor, senior editor at The Federalist, and author of Rigged: How the Media, Big Tech, and the Democrats Seized Our Elections. And here she finishes by telling me what we can do and what has been done already in some jurisdictions about the changes that the Democrats were trying to push, and what we as citizens can do to make sure we're informed about what is happening. And I think that's important the way you wrote it. I mean, I think the left won't get past the title because they're going to say rigged and they're going to run away. But the fact that, whether they disagree with it or not, or they get upset on the right, it's important to note that it's not like you're trying to prove that Trump won the election. You're talking about things that people are doing, both the media, the Democrats and big tech, that are problematic. And something needs to be done about it. So you're just sounding an alarm. It's not saying, that turn over this election and things of that nature, which leads to my final question. So now, because of you and your book, we know what the problem is. So what do we do?
So I actually think people have already been doing some good stuff. A lot of states have banned, for instance, the private takeover of government election offices. That's a very important step. Some states have done a little bit of improvement to their voter integrity projects. Like if you're I'm not a huge fan of like voting seasons with tens of millions of mail-in ballots, but if you're going to have them, you have to have more security. And so a lot of states have had slightly more security added to their laws. There's a lot more that needs to be done. But if you remember the 2020 election and what they did to it, it affected, it came down to 43,000 votes across 3 states would have had a different presidency. And it's 10,000 votes in one state would have changed the control of the Senate. These are really fine margins. And I just want to say really quickly about Georgia, because that's where so much of the action happened. That's a lot. That's where Zuckerberg primarily invested his funds. And you look at Florida, and that's a state that was narrowly won by Republicans in 2016 and 2018. And in 2020, it was a safe win for Republicans statewide. Georgia, right across the border, is where $45 million in Zuckerberg funding went. And that state moved from a very safe 5-point Republican state in 2016 to a 1-point Democrat state in 2020. That investment was huge, and it affected not just the presidency, but the control of the Senate. It was really smart funding. But point being, you can do, as Georgia has now done, banning the private takeover of government election offices. And you can do things like this. You can also just go down to your local voting place and volunteer to oversee the collection of mail-in ballots so that you can be one of the people who's making sure that there's integrity to the process. You can give money. You can, just be more involved. It's certainly a lot that can be done.
All right. Well, I guess I want to leave with 2 quick points from 2 totally different ideological views. One is Hugh Hewitt saying, if it ain't close, they can't cheat. And my mom, the 85-year-old liberal Democrat, who says, you should just vote on election day. So people get it. It's just a matter of whether we can get enough people to get it. And I think reading your book would do that. She is Mollie Hemingway, Fox News contributor, senior editor of The Federalist, co-author of Justice on Trial, and author of this new book, Rigged: How the Media, Big Tech, and the Democrats Seized Our Elections. Mollie, it's been great speaking with you. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.